It was Sunday after church, and husband and wife were driving on their way home, and the wife turned to her husband and asked, Honey, did you notice the dress that Mrs. Harvard was wearing? You know, the colors were entirely wrong for her complexion, and it was just way out of season. And the husband looked at his wife and thought, and well, no, I guess I did. I'm sorry, hon. And his wife just kind of gave a... Then she turned to him and said, well, that hemline on Martha Smith's daughter, that was just way too short for church. You know, it was just way too short for anywhere as far as that go. Surely you saw that. Husband thought a moment and said, no, dear, actually I didn't. She turned to him again. Well, you noticed, I'm sure, Darla Hemington's dress. That was cut just way too low. That was inappropriate for Sunday morning church. Tell me you saw that. And the husband thought about it and again had to say, well, no, I guess I didn't see that either. And she just kind of gave another huff, then finally turned to him and said, look, I guess it doesn't do you a whole lot of good to go to church, does it? Hopefully we have other reasons for going to church than giving fashion statements and reviews and critiques. Well, in following through the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has words to say about the lifestyle of the Christian. What is a Christian supposed to look like? How do they behave? What's their demeanor? What's their conversation like? What's their perspective? How do they see things? And now in the 7th chapter of Matthew, Jesus is really getting down to it and really getting personal, perhaps. Well, let's read the words of our Lord here in Matthew chapter 7 and hear what Jesus has to say. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it'll be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. And there's many verses in the Bible that back up what Jesus is saying here, but I just selected a couple others from the book of Romans. Romans chapter 14. You then, why do you judge your brother, sister? Why do you treat them with contempt? For we will all stand before God's judgment seat. Can I hear a gulp on that one? Verse 13. Therefore, let us stop passing judgment on one another. Instead, make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in the way of a brother or sister. And may God add power to the reading of this word, that it truly reaches our heart, to truly stimulate a healthier outlook and care for one another. Oh, this passage, do not judge or you too will be judged. I've talked to so many people, I was just sure they didn't know much of anything in the Bible, but they know this verse is in here somewhere. Somehow people aren't supposed to pass judgment over me. And that gets interpreted in many different ways. Can I just lay it down for you, the meaning of this? Don't criticize. Don't complain about other people. Don't undermine people. Don't harass them. Don't put them down. Don't slander people. Don't malign. Don't find fault. Don't nitpick. Don't blame. Don't belittle. Don't attack other people. Those are just words taken out of the dictionary. What that means, not to find ways to undercut what people are doing, but find ways to build them up. Not ways to discourage people, but ways to encourage people. Not looking for the negatives, not looking for the faults whenever they're going to show up, but expecting the more hopeful things, the more faithful things, and having faith in our heart to expect more, especially of ourselves, more of our Christian community. Centuries ago, here in America, in the Midwest, there was a church, so it was heard, and it seems well verified that they actually did this. In their church, they appointed 2 particular offices in the church. And my understanding is they had no problems filling these positions. The first position they called pointer, and the second one they called beaner. The first one, the pointer, here's what the pointer did. as the pastor would carry on with his sermon and would get to points that they were thought were particularly important, Pointer would actually stand up and say, David, you listen. Bill, you better pay attention to this point. Wouldn't you love that? I think I might have came the expression diving under the pew, ready for Pointer to come at it. And Beaner, guess what Beaner did? Had a straw, had beans, and would sit in the choir loft looking around. Is anybody nodding off? And poof, right in the noggin. Wake you up again. I can just imagine how many teenage boys lined up for that job. Wow, I could be a bean shooter right during church. Wouldn't you just love to be in a church like that? Wouldn't that just be a great experience? Boy, that's the height of passing judgment right there. Why do people pass judgment over one another? Why do we do that? What's the impulse that causes that to happen? Sometimes we're trying to control people. We expect them to meet up to our standards. Sometimes a personal compulsion to make things orderly and predictable the way that I want them to be. I want to preserve something, and people better jump to what I have to say to them. It's a personal sense of power. I want to be in control, and we all deal with these things. We have to learn how to balance these things in life. Some just go a little bit too far with it, and it causes pain. It causes hurt to other people. We all have that tendency. We all have the ability to pass judgment. It can be a compulsion perhaps with all of us. But Jesus calls us to put a harness on it, put a limit on it. Just save it. It's not necessary, and it doesn't help. I appreciate John Stott, the way that he put it. I always like John Stott's writings. He gets right to the point. John Stott explained it this way. Jesus does not tell us to cease to be people by suspending our critical powers, which help to distinguish us from the animals, but to renounce the presumptuous ambition that we might be God ourselves by setting ourselves up as judges. This is God's area. It's not ours. We don't have that right to pass judgment over people. As Paul says in the book of Romans, eventually we're all going to stand before God someday in judgment. And Jesus in other places says, be careful what you say. We have to be accountable for every careless word. That should bring another gulp. Every careless word is going to come out. For some, that judgment day is going to be a long time, working through all those statements and having to be fast talkers about it all. What does all of it mean? Jesus himself had to deal with judgment. He himself was slandered, victimized by gossip, and the Pharisees passed judgment over him. Did you know that? Matthew chapter 9 and Matthew chapter 11. The Pharisees had him pegged. They were calling him a glutton, calling him a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors, and a friend of sinners. And they like to pass that all around. And Jesus just bring it right up, right out in the open. This is what people are saying about me. I know it. But he also concluded that by saying, wisdom is proved right by her deeds. I think he's asking all to be wise, to be smart, suspend judgment until we hear the other side of things, hear the whole truth. It's all about love, loving one another. If we truly love one another, why would we put obstacles in the way of one another? That's what Paul's saying in the book of Romans. Why would you want to do that? In 1 John, John writes it this way, dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. And hear this, hard words but true. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. If we have that natural desire for love for one another, that's God's influence coming into it. But that impulse to not love, to trip up people, to put obstacles in people's ways, John's saying that doesn't come from God. God has nothing to do with that. And you need to pay attention on where it came from and make note. It doesn't help. It's not healthy at all. Came upon an interesting story. An interesting book was written about it by the author Will Bowen, and he's a pastor of a church. In his church, he just got tired of it. People would complain about everything. Have you ever heard complaining in churches? It also happens in Lions clubs and rec centers too, by the way. But the pastor got tired of it, and he found himself doing it too. And that's what really caught him. He said, I'm going to stop. And so he came up with a plan. And he invited other people in the church if they'd participate with him. And they got these rubber bands. You see them colored rubber bands? Put them on their wrist. And they said, okay, here's what we're going to do. When we catch ourselves complaining, we're going to take that rubber band, pull it, and smack ourselves right on the wrist. And then take it off and put it on the other hand. And others got into it, said, yeah, maybe that's the reminder we need. And so they took the vow. We're going to learn how to stop complaining. And in his book, A Complaint-Free World, very interesting. I really had a lot of hope in this. He said it took a while, but he called it a period of waking up. They weren't aware they were doing it. They would automatically complain, automatically criticize. And so they would have that rubber band there, and they hear each other do it. Just snap it right on the wrist. And then they'd switch it around to the other hand. And then next time they complain, they whack themselves again. And the pastor, Reverend Bowen, he came to church the next Sunday after making the vow, and somebody noticed his rubber band was on the other wrist. And he said, oh, I guess you didn't do so well, did you? I see your rubber band's on the other wrist. And he said, fortunately, they didn't figure it out. I'd already switched wrists about 20 times that week, and it just happened to end up on the other wrist. But he said he kept working at it, and he came up with the book, A Complaint-Free World. And they also had an offer. And actually, I confess, I was on Amazon.com. I had ordered 100 of those rubber bands, and I was going to invite people. Anybody want to take the challenge with me? Let's see if we can do it. Could go without complaining and learn to get complaining, criticizing out of our lives altogether. And I was going to buy 100, and I know it's probably too many, but I figured some of us would probably wear the rubber band out, and we would need another one. So I had replacements ready. And at the last minute, I said, oh, maybe next summer. Maybe we'll hold off on that one. But what do you think? Do you think we could do it? To go a whole summer, to go a lifetime without complaining anymore, without any more criticizing. Just let it go. Don't do it at all. Doesn't that sound like a great church? Reverend Bowen talks about his church. What happened? He said the results were incredible. They were wonderful. People started responding to all of this, and they learned how to do it. Said it wasn't automatic. It took a long time for people to go for 2 or 3 weeks without complaining, but snapping their wrists was definitely a motivator. But here's some things that happened. After they did it for some months and they started finding out some testimonies about it, people would come in and say they'd had their annual checkup. People that had trouble with high blood pressure, guess what? Well, it wasn't a miracle healing, but it was across the board. It was definitely better. People had improvements. People were getting along better. They had happier relationships. People were laughing more. People were doing better at their work. People found that others liked to spend time with them because they know that they weren't going to hear complaining and criticizing. People gained more friends. People liked coming to church because they knew when they came to church they weren't going to get criticized. They wouldn't have to listen to complaining. They found that other people felt better about bringing their friends to church because they knew their friends wouldn't have to hear the complaining and criticizing. So across the board, everything was a miracle in his church. Everybody did so much better. And I was reading an interview of Reverend Bowen, and he said, people learned how to be happier. And then he stopped himself. He goes, wait a minute, let me correct that. It's not so many they learned how to be happier. He says, I think a lot of our people, for the first time in their lives, they learn how to be happy, just happy altogether, to be able to be relaxing and to not have to exert so much energy looking for faults. But they come to church looking for compliments. They're looking for positive things to say. They have enough energy and courage to stop it when they hear complaining. Say, please don't do that. That's not why I come to church. I don't come to listen to that. I come to find God. I come to enliven my spiritual life. Can we please put an end to all of that? Can I ask you, church, can we be this way? Can we be a church that's not criticizing, complaining, not doing these things, not passing judgment? It starts with you and me to just start it. Or just say, stop it ourselves. Don't do it ourselves. And when we hear it, have enough courage to say, let's not do that, okay? Can we just leave that outside the facility? When you come into the church, just let it go. Passing judgment, criticizing can be such a harmful spirit. It can plant seeds of suspicion and doubt. In churches when there's too much criticizing, people don't like to volunteer for things because they know they'll be criticized. It stifles that process. It leaves a sense of pride and arrogance. It breaks down our community, breaks down the unity of the church. It causes bad things that only hurt. And as Paul says in the book of Galatians, don't be deceived. God cannot be mocked. One reaps what they sow. Just like Jesus says, for the measurement you judge others, it'll come right back at you, and you'll be judged in the same way. Jesus comes not to bring judgment, not to bring condemnation. That's not his point. That's not his motivation. He comes to bring love. He comes to bring forgiveness. He comes to bring hope. Doesn't that sound good? To have hope in life, to have a fresh start, to have a fresh life, to have a positive spirit where we grow, where we become fully alive, where we become the blessed of our Lord God. It's not that far from any of us. That blessing is here for all who are willing to receive.